Now, mass anti-government demonstrations are planned in Bahrain, and the government has promised a strong response. Today marks the country's 42nd anniversary of independence from Britain and exactly 2.5 years since the current wave of unrest started. Police confronting protesters and firing clouds of tear gas, these scenes have become common in the Gulf nation ever since the uprising began. That's despite constant talks between the ruling Sunni family and the opposition. The Shia majority in the country want a constitutional monarchy with a government which is chosen to serve in a democratically elected parliament. RT's Lucy Kafanov details the key events of the unrest over the past 2.5 years.
A majority Shiite country ruled by the Sunni Al Khalifa family, Bahrain has been rocked by political unrest since 2011. Now, for the past 2 years, the majority Shiite opposition has been pushing for democratic reforms and more say in their government. But those demands have been met with an iron fist. So let's take a look at how these events actually unfolded. In February of 2011, a day of rage. Thousands of Bahrainis gathered in unprecedented demonstrations against the country's rulers. Several people were killed, some 300 injured when security forces raided the protesters who were camped out in the country's capital. Now, the foreign minister dismissed the violence as accidental. But there would be no resolution. As the unrest continued, troops from Saudi Arabia and the UAE entered Bahrain in order to help suppress the uprising. The king declared martial law the following day. Bahraini forces moved to clear hundreds of demonstrators from a camp that had become the symbol of the uprising, arresting more than 1,000 protesters, including leading opposition figures. Now, over the summer, 8 Shiite pro-democracy activists were sentenced to life in prison for their role in the uprising. Later that fall, a government inquiry had found the security forces used excessive force to suppress the protests, even torturing detainees in order to get confessions. Now, March saw one of the biggest demonstrations in Bahrain's history. That same month, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights criticized Bahrain for disproportionate use of force, adding that tear gas may have led to more than 30 deaths. Now, in February 2013, 2 demonstrators and a policeman were killed in clashes that took place the following month on the 2nd anniversary of that uprising. And ahead of today's protests, the king toughened penalties in anti-terror laws, approving proposals that have alarmed human rights groups which fear a crackdown on the demonstrations. It's an Arab Spring revolution that has been forsaken by the Arabs, abandoned by the West, and largely ignored by the international community. But without meaningful reforms, Bahrain's uprising isn't likely to quiet down anytime soon.
So Bahrain toughened up its anti-protest laws last month, drawing condemnation from the UN and other human rights groups. Jalal Farouz is a former Bahraini MP for the country's largest opposition party and had his citizenship revoked for allegedly threatening national security. He told us why the Western world isn't doing anything about the harsh crackdown by Bahraini authorities.
There have been lots of violations in Bahrain, but unfortunately there is rarely anything in the Western media regarding all the violations. Torture is daily act, and also the rapporteur of the United Nations on torture have been stopped from going to Bahrain, but that has not made this shameful way of supporting the government by the Western governments. Of course, over the past week, 3 of the major human rights groups, in Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and Redress, they have issued very strong urging for the UK government, Western governments, to stop supporting the dictator and try to enforce respect of the human rights. But unfortunately, the money and the petrodollar talks higher than the principles in the West. That is very unfortunate.